Awesome. So, welcome everyone today to our Metagov seminar on Wednesday, April 8th. Today, we're super excited to have Brett Frischmann here. Brett is, a researcher and former professor and book author. His book, Infrastructure, the Social Value of Shared Resources, was written in 2012, but he has continued to expand this work, recently giving a keynote speech at the Silicon Flatirons Conference at the University of Colorado Law School in February of this year. His work really applies, like I was saying, across the board to a lot of the different aspects that we're involved in and researching in here at Metagov, including the commons, network neutrality and intellectual property, or just kind of public infrastructure and some of the different social and economic aspects behind it. So thank you so much, Brett, for joining us, and I'll pass it to you for your presentation.
Awesome. So let me do share screen, get this going. One sec. Oh, I don't know why it's messing with me. There we go. And share. All right, there we go. Can you guys see the infrastructure? You guys can see it? All right, cool. Um, all right. So thanks everyone. I'm going to jump right in. Got plenty to discuss. It's cool to be back. I gave a talk maybe a year and a half ago or so about friction in design, friction design regulation, which is still an active research area. I'm doing tons of experiments and different work in that area. I was kind of excited to get someone asked me to, Liz asked me to come back and talk about infrastructure stuff because apparently it's been popping up a bunch. So I thought, sure. So let's see. It's not advancing the screen. There we go. So I waffled between sort of giving two different talks. I'll admit. The One focus exclusively on the infrastructure book and the theory that it develops and applies, and the other focus on how infrastructure ideas permeate three different sort of research agendas of mine and lead to, I think, a rather provocative and unfinished or I should say, not fully developed idea that I thought would be fun to run by the group, by you. And so I ended up leaning towards the second talk because I thought it would be maybe more fun and something we can, if you want to sort of dig just into infrastructure stuff more or the details, we can always go back pretty easily and during the Q&A. So what I'm going to do is present some ideas drawn from these three books, which represent three different research tracks that I see as completely integrated, but most people don't. No, the main focus will be on the infrastructure book. But I want to start at the end rather than at the beginning. And so I thought I might start with this idea of being human in the 21st century and what that might mean, which is the sort of topic of the 2018 Reengineering Humanity book. Um, what is the future of humanity? And possibly thinking about the idea of humanity as infrastructure or infrastructural in terms of it as a concept. So human beings have special powers, right? We can imagine things that don't exist, and we can communicate about such things in person at a distance and across time and even across generations. We can talk about these imagined things. These special powers or capabilities allow us to develop shared culture, beliefs, laws, technologies, and other infrastructures that are essential to cooperation in modern civilization. And so, I think, what matters normatively most about being human is how we exercise these powers across generations to shape our world and ourselves. This is how we argue back in the 2018 book. This is how we engineer humanity. Um, because of our special powers, we can determine what worlds to build, and we can ask normative questions like, to what end? And so these are a set of fundamental questions we need to be asking more deliberately We certainly answer them one way or another. Like most infrastructure, they easily fade into the background and they're taken for granted. But we shouldn't take them for granted. These are the infrastructural governance questions about world building. And so perhaps the most ambitious infrastructural idea that we've engineered for ourselves over the past few centuries, reflected in serious intergenerational commitments, is the belief that despite many environmental contingencies that are outside of our control, that shape who we are and what's possible, we can be authors of our own lives. We can have some meaningful agency or degree of freedom, but this freedom is not naturally given or inevitable. It is contingent, and it's contingent on the techno-social environments, that is, the infrastructures that we build and choose to sustain. And so I'll return to these questions at the end, but I wanted to sort of surface them in the beginning. And then now we can go back, essentially back to the beginning, at least the beginning of my like my academic journey that started back in the late 90s, thinking mostly about infrastructure and the social value of shared resources. So the project on the whole is about it started out as me thinking pretty hard about these foundational resources, but from the demand side. Uh, and I really was drawn to like all of the things that we take for granted. And it's sort of a conversation that's often I often have with students, or I used to have a lot with my kids. It's just the things that you don't realize, like where does the energy come from? How does the food end up on your plate? How are we able to cooperate in the ways that we're able to cooperate? There's so many things about our day-to-day lives that we just take for granted, the sacrifices of prior generations and the things that have been built that we are just blessed to have, that can structure who we are and what we can do. And so I spent a lot of time trying to think about where does the value come from for these kinds of infrastructural resources. And sort of the approach to this project initially was very much rooted in it's interdisciplinary, but it's rooted in law and economics, bridging. I used to teach intellectual property and internet law and torts and other things, but it was sort of rooted in various disciplines in law, regulated industries, antitrust, intellectual property, but also many different disciplines within economics, basic micro econ, but also environmental and ecosystem economics. There wasn't really a field of infrastructure economics. There still really isn't a field of infrastructure economics, but back then there certainly wasn't. It also is interdisciplinary in that I was a math and physics undergrad and graduate school in engineering, and so I brought STS and engineering, did a lot of reading, and that sort of also is sort of embedded in the initial project and the approach. So the table of contents you have the PDF's available on Slack if people want to see the book, if we want the copy of the book. But here's the PD the table of contents, and I'm only showing you this to illustrate just like the approach and the breadth of the book, like the way I was thinking about it back then. We're going to mostly focus on chapter 4 in terms of what I'm going to try to some of the basic ideas that might be useful that I thought I would talk a bit about. But it starts by building economic foundations because it's built on a bunch of economic concepts. Part two is like the contribution, the big theory. Part three deals with some of the complications that if you're going to focus on the demand side, you kind of have to also deal with the supply side, congestion, managing congestion, things like that. But then the latter half of the book just applies those ideas to conventional or traditional infrastructure as well as non-traditional things you wouldn't ordinarily think of as infrastructure, but that functionally perform that way. Things we take for granted, but that are sort of the things we all rely on and share. So things like environmental infrastructure and intellectual infrastructure being key examples. So let me offer you the following definition of infrastructure. This is sort of drawn from chapter 4. It's built out quite a bit. And the claim, at least, is that many traditional infrastructure, whether road systems, telephone networks, electricity grids, satisfy this definition, as do a wide range of resources that are not traditionally considered to be infrastructure. Lakes, ideas, the internet. And it's built with a bunch of economic concepts, which I'm going to briefly walk through, but not sort of go into in super detail, although we can if people would like to. And so the first idea is we're talking about resources that are consumed non-rivalrously essentially talking about public goods. So infrastructure resources are a special kind of public good. What that basically means is the marginal cost of allowing an additional person to access and use the resource are zero. Non-rivalry opens the door to widespread access and productive use of the resource. And what that ends up meaning is that infrastructure are shareable in the sense that the resource can be accessed and used by multiple users at the same time or over time. And there's some complications when you get into partial non-rivalry, which if we want to talk about, we can talk about in Q&A, but I'm not going to sort of emphasize that point right now. Um, the second criterion emphasizes that this is where we get special. It's a special kind of public good. What makes it special is in part that we're talking about inputs. The demand for these things are derived. Value is produced when people make use of the resource to produce something else. So we can think of that as a public capital good. And we want to focus on users' willingness to pay, but also on what they're able to produce because that's where the demand is ultimately going to be derived from. And then the third criterion focuses on the fact that we're talking about general infrastructure or general purpose inputs. They serve a wide variety of user activities. They support the production of private, public, and social goods. And so they're generic in terms of their design. And so what that, infrastructures then we can understand as enabling different systems, markets and non-markets, to function to satisfy this derived demand from different types of users. Infrastructure are not special purpose resources. They're not optimized for particular use or user to satisfy demand derived from a particular downstream user or downstream market. Rather, the key functional aspect of infrastructure is that you have got a basic multi-purpose functionality, and that can kind of be you can also think of that as a basic public capability or human capability. So again, the bottom line is infrastructure are shareable means to many ends. That's one catch line in the book that often gets people often sort of pick up on and use. Another is that if you think about most infrastructure, they vary in what the capabilities are, but they provide a capability that is often essential to human flourishing or enables people to be productive in different ways in their lives. Okay, so one way to start understanding like why this matters and the theory that sort of I develop. I'm going to quickly use some demand curves. I'm only using this to make a conceptual point, so I don't care about the technical details so much. It would be nice to formally model all of this, but that's not what I'm presenting. I really am just using this conceptually so you can see like the point. So right, if we're thinking about a standard demand curve, downward sloping demand curve, we're just thinking about, what are people willingness to pay for some good? It might look like this, these blue curves. And when we're talking about goods that when a user makes use of a resource to produce and there's some kind of spillover or externality associated, what we'll often do is say, well, if it's a positive externality or a positive spillover, well, society might demand that resource, but might be willing to pay above and beyond what the individual. So we might shift the demand curve up and have that red curve right there. Right? This is sort of what an economist would often do is they're sort of thinking about externalities or spillovers. So one move made in the book way back when was to say, well, really, there's no reason to think that when users produce spillovers, they're uniform. Right? There's no reason to think that users generate the same spillovers or the same public or social goods. In fact, the social demand curve could be that green curve for all that we know. Right? There's no reason to think it takes the same shape. So that's one initial move. Now, if we think about infrastructure, it might be useful to construct demand curves by instead of focusing on each individual's willingness to pay, to focus instead on different use types, different downstream markets or downstream kinds of categories of uses and what people within those categories or buckets would be willing to pay in order to make use of the infrastructure to engage in a certain kind of activity. And so one way to do that is you get something like this kind of step function, still downward sloping. And the idea is different uses of the infrastructure, right, have different private demand. People within that use type are willing to pay a certain amount And so we might rank access to infrastructure for certain use types according to something like this. Um, if we again assume that if there are externalities or spillovers associated with people making different, uses of the infrastructure, we might initially do what an economist would do and just shift, say, okay, well, the social demand curve takes that red line. But again, the observation that there's no reason to think that different users generate the same externality or the same magnitude or type of externality. We might very well imagine that the social demand curve was the green one rather than the red one, right? That the use of the infrastructure for which people are the least willing to pay because they don't capture much of the benefit might actually be the one that generates a large positive spillover, large externalities, or large positive effects. But of course, it might not be that green curve. It could be the purple one, and we can do this endlessly, to be honest. Um, so what does all this mean? Let me jump to an example I used in the book that sometimes was helpful, that people enjoyed. I used to sort of talk about YouTube as an infrastructure and say, okay, well, suppose someone's generating, my son Matthew's birthday party video, and I say, I take what am I intending as a user of YouTube's platform? I may create this video and share it so my family can see it. I may have an intended audience of, say, 25 people, family and friends. I post it on YouTube, I share the link, and it turns out that 168 views turn up, right? 100 more than my family. For some odd reason, people found watching my kid blow out some candles or something at his birthday funny, interesting, worth watching. They watch the whole video. Hey, hey, there you go. And so there's a small positive benefit for those extra, 100 plus people who are able to watch the video and be entertained for a short period of time. Um, Similarly, I don't know if you're familiar, this is an old example, but the Charlie Bit My Finger video posted on YouTube, similar kind of things. Someone posted it's intended for a grandfather to watch. The intended audience, I think, was just one, but maybe it was 25 family and friends. It turns out not just to satisfy 168 other, 150 other viewers, but instead it generates millions and millions of views. It goes viral. It has comments, it has social commentary, there's likes, there's dislikes, it's incredibly entertaining. And so it becomes like, you might think of it as like a killer app style video in the sense that no one anticipated that this video intended for one would end up entertaining so many. And so I used to use these two examples to just illustrate two types of phenomena that are at the extreme examples, and there's everything in between. But both of those examples generate spillovers. One of them generates small scale spillovers. But the thing is, if millions of people are generating videos that generate small scale positive spillovers, those positive spillovers add up. They still matter. And similarly, the occasional video that is the killer one that goes viral, goes crazy, and generates a ton of value from that one video. It may happen less frequently, but it still generates this value that wasn't captured. And the basic idea is that ex ante, neither the market nor the government would officially select either type. Right? They'd never pick these winners. They'd never know that Bit My Finger was going to be the one that went viral. They wouldn't know that the dad who posted it was going to be the person who would post the video. And similarly, there's no reason to subsidize or recognize that the individuals generating those small scale spillovers would do so. But open infrastructure supports the basic user capability. And this is just an example to illustrate a phenomena, but I think you can see this kind of phenomena over and over again across different infrastructure types. So one way I used to try to illustrate this idea was with this picture, right? So it's infrastructure enable people to be productive in different ways, in different systems, and they generate value that is sometimes captured in output markets or in markets. And even when there are output markets, there still are spillovers sometimes you can't capture, but there's also spillovers from public and social goods in non-market systems. Okay, so you might wonder, why does this matter, these weird curves? What's the point of this? Well, again, the blue curves are based on users' willingness to pay, and markets tend to rely on the blue curves to allocate resources, both in the existing resources and investment into new resources, right? The other colored curves that include the spillovers of the extra value, those curves are often not known or are in some cases not knowable. Like it's hard to know what the shape of the curve would look like. Um, and why does that matter? Um, well, one way to see what can happen if we rely on markets to allocate resources or to allocate access to the infrastructure itself is when we're relying on those blue lines and those curves, is a misallocation from a static perspective or a misoptimization over time from a dynamic perspective of the infrastructure. So infrastructures that are capable of generating social value to meet those other curves ends up instead becoming a commercial infrastructure or a special purpose input into a narrow range of use types. One way of understanding that is that there are static and dynamic market failures that are driven by the demand side, that are driven by users' willingness to pay being a bad measure of value and a bad sort of indicator of what we ought to support. And these market failures aren't mitigated by competition or enabling user choice because user choice and competition would still rely on the blue curves. The static and dynamic, it's not just that markets fail, but it's also that there are static and dynamic government failures that are driven by the demand side because the standard tools the government might use to support public goods production, like picking a winner and giving them subsidies or tax incentives, don't work as well either. Um, so one thing that we do and have done for a long time with many different kinds of infrastructure, whether intentionally or not, I'm not making a claim here, is that we govern or manage infrastructure as a commons, meaning that everyone has access on more or less equal terms. There's no discrimination or priority based on who you are and what you're doing. Typically in common, we're talking about common. I have a whole lot of work on governing knowledge common commons. Like when normally when we talk about commons, there's a community, and it matters what the community is. For a lot of the early infrastructure work, the relevant community is the public at large, and so it turns into sort of an open access, public at large style commons. But the key rule that I focused on early on was this non-discrimination rule for members of that community. Um, and what Commons does is Commons alleviates the need to rely on the market or the government to pick winners. You could think of it as resistance to optimization. Um, and another way to think, there's a couple different ways to think about this, and I'm going to do it quick. Another way to think about it is in terms of option theory. This is not something I've written a ton about, but I'm trying to remember Scott Bradner and someone else wrote an article about using option theory to sort of explain the argument from the infrastructure book. But the idea with the social option is where there's a high uncertainty regarding users or which users or uses are going to generate social value over time, right? There's a reason to not optimize or specialize, but to instead continue waiting and seeing, right? Keep your options open. Another way to see the argument about the relationship between commons governance and the infrastructure is to think of commons governance as a means for leveraging non-rivalry in order to sustain the user's capacity to be productive in those other systems, to generate those outputs of those public and social goods. So these are just a couple of different ways that I've tried to explain or lay out the argument. In the context of the internet, which is one of the examples I spend quite a bit of time on, have spent quite a bit of time on over the years. This is probably a pretty decent and familiar example for people on the call. Um, if you think about the internet's evolving with an end-to-end design principle to preserve its robustness and its evolvability over time, and the ability to allow applications to be easily layered on top of it. End-to-end design is implemented at the logical infrastructure, TCP/IP protocols there that basically provide a generic technology and application independent interface to the infrastructure. And that effectively sustains a commons on the infrastructure in the sense that infrastructure owners cannot discriminate or prioritize based on the identity of users or uses. In other words, based on who you are, what you're doing. Um, the, Blake Reed and I have an article just a few years ago about understanding end-to-end architecture, net neutrality as a kind of governance seam, where friction at the seam makes it hard to exercise discrimination or prioritization. But that's all embedded in commitments, private commitments, not law. And so a debate for a while has been about whether you need net neutrality rules or an open internet order. And why is it, well, money, power, and power in politics, or as I sometimes would do it in an internet law class with students, I would say, well, if you've got a problem at the content layer, like say it's copyright infringement, or it could be bullying, or it could be whatever. What do you do? Well, you should regulate it directly, and in fact, we do. But we also regulate it indirectly by going down a layer. Why do we go down a layer to the applications layer? Well, then you can regulate more than just one problem. The application layer affords more intelligence and more power. And of course, that same point applies when you go down another layer and you hit the infra and you get into the infrastructure. Um, so this is, an ongoing debate that's been around for a while about net neutrality rules. One thing I will throw out, and then I'll move on because time I want to get to Q&A and whatnot. Um, I don't think anyone else frames it this way, but I've always seen net neutrality as the regulation of intelligence-enabled control. To me, that is fundamentally what net neutrality or open internet rules are about. In other words, broadband internet access service providers have specific fine-grained intelligence about who's doing what online, and the rules prohibit them from using that intelligence to exercise control through specific means, blocking, throttling, paid prioritization, conditioning, etc. And so I think I've always thought the net neutrality debate is a precursor to the kinds of debates we should be having for other infrastructures where intelligence-enabled control, for example, through AI, are become feasible. So whether we're talking about smart grids, smart transportation, smart cities, smart homes, you name it, whenever someone uses the word smart, you should put supposedly in front, or whenever someone's talking about AI, switch to talk about smart technology and evaluate it this way. But we should be concerned with this question of intelligence-enabled control. And so a recurring issue is how smart should our infrastructures be? How can we govern intelligence and intelligence-enabled control? And how do we think through our governance options? I mean, net neutrality rules, top-down regulation is not going to fit all of our problems. It's not always going to work. And so we're often going to have to rely on other mechanisms. And I'll do this briefly. This is where the governing knowledge commons work often comes in. It's a core theme in that empirical work. Building on Ostrom, we've got a framework that we've been using for a few decades now to study knowledge, public goods, and intellectual infrastructures. This is the framework in part, like the sets of questions we use to sort of structure research questions. This is way too much on a slide. Don't get caught up on it. It's just a structure. You can find out more at knowledgecommons.net. There's a whole book series, tons of books and case studies and whatnot. Some Metagov folks are actually involved in the latest book that we're doing in governance of AI, knowledge commons. But I'm put this here to suggest that building on the GKC book on smart cities and some of that work, Madeline Sanfilippo and I in the Internet Policy Review published a paper a little bit ago about slow governance. And the idea was moving from a research framework to a sort of a decision-making framework for governance of supposedly smart tech or AI in cities, schools, and other communities. And we thought that there's just a series of questions, governance questions, prior to investment and deployment that any school or city ought to be able to answer. And these kinds of questions were informed by the GKC framework as well as sort of the capabilities framework. And so, again, one way to think about it is under pressure to optimize and using smart tech to optimize to drive this process. We were thinking that, slow governance is one, or commons governance and slow governance actually become related to each other as a way to sort of to resist that pressure to optimize, that market logic to optimize for a narrower range of uses. And so this is sort of a new idea that we've been playing around with. Again, as I mentioned, that we used the GKC framework to set out some of those questions, but then we started looking at the capabilities approach and some human rights frameworks to sort of expand it a little bit more. This is a work in progress, and so I don't want to dwell too much on it. Of course, like this issue of, how smart should our infrastructures be? How should we govern intelligence and intelligence-enabled control ends up being the main subject of the Re-Engineering Humanity book. That book expands and deepens the analysis for supposedly smart systems. There's a whole series of, this is more than we can get into right now, a whole series of questions about understanding the relationship between intelligence and governance, and the set of human capabilities that we might care about. It's not just focused on infrastructure, but it's focused on technosocial environments, which are often infrastructural. Um, One way I thought would be easy to make the point, though, I suppose, is rather than dwelling on these little details, is you're all familiar with the trolley car dilemma and its application to smart cars or smart systems. So we do a version of that in Reengineering Humanity. You're in a smart car, who should die, basically? How do we allocate access to life-saving technology on a smart system? Or in other words, who should we prioritize? Or should we prioritize at all? And so there's a whole series of possibilities, one of which, number six, is sort of a neutrality, a net neutrality style principle. But there's other ways we might prioritize, including, I can't really see which one, maybe the fourth one, which is we could do it on willingness to pay. We could measure willingness or value of life, like who's more valuable. There's lots of ways to do this. If you're familiar with MIT's Moral Machines project, maybe you've played around with this. If you haven't, you should. You can kind of walk through the scenario and find out where your preferences lie. But the point is, what logic or value system determines who lives or dies and who decides? Um, it's not just about life-saving technology, of course, right? It's also about accident avoiding technology, right? When you can use smart technology to figure out not just who lives and dies, but also how to prioritize access to accident avoidance. There's a bunch of different, well, it's not just accidents. Wait a minute. There's all kinds of costs and benefits that smart transportation systems will manage. Who's going to miss if there's congestion on the bridge? Who's going to miss their meeting? Um, the ultimate question. The point of the trolley car dilemma is too easily missed. It's fundamentally about the basic normative questions. And I think what we want to realize is that traffic engineering is social planning. Like one way or another, traffic engineering is social planning. And so making choices about how we engineer traffic flows, and that's just but transportation on like a road system, it's transportation of pretty much anything, is fundamentally a question of social planning and value judgment. And so, how am I doing on time? I haven't been looking at the time. Oh, I should probably wrap up in a second. Okay, I'll wrap up in like a minute or two. So, let me, yeah, maybe skip this. There's like a few things I was going to say, but let me jump. Um, So in Reengineering Humanity, we frame the two-end question in terms of various competing values, welfare and hedonism versus human flourishing. Um, I worry quite a bit that the logics of efficiency, convenience, and fetishized computation are relentlessly driving us down an optimization path, what we called engineered determinism in that book. But we're rushing down a path towards ubiquitous infrastructural systems that micromanage our always-on lives. And in a sense, I hadn't really realized till you guys Metagov got me to think back to infrastructure, that much of what we are diagnosing and reengineering humanity sort of boils down to this sort of this optimization problem, like this pressure to optimize for a narrow range of uses for profit making or for appropriating value or just the things that we know as opposed to the things we don't. Um, you know, Built infrastructures are optimized for a narrower range of uses to maximize profit. Well, what does that mean for social media, Gen AI, and other infrastructure that are optimized for a rather narrow range of activities that in Orwellian terms are called engagement, all the while shaping who we are and can possibly even be? So often, supposedly smart tech is pitched or AI is pitched and sold as something that's expanding human potential, that provides broader capabilities to be productive, but that often seems to be illusory. Um, Again, commons governance is about sustaining a wide range of user activity and opportunities and providing resistance to optimization. One of the concerns that I have is that we're not optimizing systems for the human. We're kind of removing the human user from the equation. And so I think I'm trying to I ran through a few of those things quickly because I realized I went a little bit longer than 25 minutes. Oh my gosh. So I will stop there and close my screen, stop sharing, and we can look at each other. There we go. So was not following the chat in the slightest, so I have no ideas what you were saying in there. Should I read the chat real quick or should we just open up for Q&A, right? It's probably best.
Yeah, we could open it up. Brett, thank you so much. I would love to see your slides if you wouldn't mind sharing them so we can dig in because I wanted to hear what you were saying, and so I didn't get to get into the details of the slides. But yeah, the chat is definitely going off, but I haven't had a chance to kind of organize questions. Was there a first question that popped in that we want to start with in here? We can make it just kind of an open discussion now, though. Yeah, Steve.
Uh, I'm still, do you have any methods that you're recommending for the de-optimization of humanity?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yes, I mean that's my friction and design talk from way back when is part of that. So the slow governance, friction and design are like two of the two main um, interventions that I've been suggesting, right? So
And is
one
that
is
friction in designs or friction of the design process itself?
friction. Well, so that's good, but could be both. But friction in design is the term I was using, and what I mean by that is take CAPTCHAs, right? So no one loves them, just like no one likes speed bumps on roads, right? But CAPTCHAs provide you perform a task, performs a pro-social function in terms of providing security. That we could do them better. It's CAPTCHAs aren't the best example either, but the idea is thinking about designing friction
Yeah, we want
into
captchas, but fun is what you're
but yeah,
saying.
fun or pro-social ones, right? So we
Right,
want to
exactly right.
design
Yeah, a little
pro-social
side benefit
friction.
while you do it, right?
Yep. Right. And so we want things that instead of frictionless design that leads people to system one type thinking and away from system two type thinking. Um, in other words, sort of superficial forms of click type, swipe type engagement. So there's a variety of interventions that involve different kinds of frictions that are pro-social that slow things down, but they slow things down in a way that enables people to participate more actively. Those are just that. I mean, that's sort of there's like one set of interventions that are about that concern that. Um,
So another is, would you call something that limits reach, for example, this type of friction, like a limited number of likes, or that you can only like pass something on to your friend of a friend, but you can't
yeah.
pass it on to your friend of your friend to your friend,
Yes.
stuff like that.
Right.
Would you put that all
Yeah.
in the same category?
Yeah, so WhatsApp's fast forwarding restriction is one we've talked about. So WhatsApp has a fast forwarding restriction that limits virality. It applies to all messages, so it's content neutral. But the goal of it is to just basically dampen down. It doesn't make it so you can't go viral, but it makes it harder for things to go viral. So that when they do go viral, it's more for like because of its concerted effort. Um, that's just one. I mean, yes, it's one example. Yeah, so that things that you can have all kind. Another one is infinite scroll versus finite scroll, right? So infinite scroll is a frictionless system to keep people from thinking about whether they should self-govern. Finite scrolling, like having a constraint on how things preload or how many things you can watch in a row, or there's a bunch of different ways to design it, would enable you to think about what you're doing. So you can use friction to enable governance processes, either by yourself or by others, if it's a community.
What's the incentives to make that happen? What's the right mix of regulatory, marketing, etc.?
That's a great question. I mean, I think in some areas that you need law. I mean, I think
Hmm.
you need regulation. So I'm working on stuff about manipulative design features and why we should have liability for manipulative
Hmm.
design features. And so like I think infinite scroll is a manipulative design feature for which you should be liable when for harm. And you also can just ban them, right? So some or uh, Another feature that drives us, like sort of optimizes for superficial engagement, is personal data-driven algorithmic targeting. So using personal data to drive algorithms to personalize content in a feed um, is another example of what I would call a manipulative design feature that produces a kind of antisocial behavior. And so one can either hold companies liable for harms that result when people are addicted to their feeds. Addictive design cases, two big ones came down a couple weeks ago. Or like the New York State Safe for Kids Act, you could ban addictive design, addictive feeds being available to children or minors without parental consent. And then if the company doesn't want to do the age verification at all because that has its own problems, then it might just not, just sort of you're nudging them towards not having, considering alternatives. And in Europe, there's some
Right.
regulation that allows you to have to opt out of personal data driven feeds.
And there's
And
also
What's
so
the
this.
optimum combination between the European regulate first and the US sue for harm? How could we leverage those two systems to get somewhere with the large global companies or to fund better alternatives?
Yeah, well, that's the third thing that you just mentioned at the end is another good. I mean, so, pro-social design is something that there may very well be niche markets for. And so it may very well be that the market can support alternatives, but you've got to start small and build. Um, the I don't know that there's a universe. Again, one of the difficulties in this kind, like in the thing I'm proposing and talking about, and then the actual real life implementation of things, is that it varies considerably based on the context, right? So, you know, companion chatbots are a very different kind of problem in general, and they're a different kind of problem in the healthcare setting than they are in schools, than they are in like general commercial availability. And each of those different settings and that particular problem uh, will trigger different concerns about like regulation versus liability rules versus try to market incentives. And I just picked that randomly. We could instead switch over to social media, or we could switch over to things like ed tech in general. I mean, I think like from my take on ed tech is like most ed tech is garbage. If you employed slow governance principles and basically said you've got to prove we need evidence of learning benefits before you buy or implement anything that involves digital tech in a school, we wouldn't have laptops in schools or we wouldn't have software. There's a lot of things we wouldn't bother to have in schools because they don't have proven learning benefits that the vendors have been able to sort of demonstrate in advance. And so the one kind of answer to your question is just there's not a particular mix of regulation, liability rules, market incentives. It's sort of looking for the right combination in different contexts.
I have a question on a different topic, which is coming back to kind of AI as public infrastructure, and you made an argument that we should see AI as, and I guess the companies that own it as kind of having, I forget the phrase you used, but like private knowledge, right? Like it's like they have um because they control the systems, like they have this like private knowledge that therefore that's a reason why like they shouldn't have access to private knowledge if it's like coming from public people and information. Could you describe again like yeah, exactly like what that term was and then like how can we leverage that? Because we have a big project, public AI, that Metagov has been partnering with has cultivated, it's and I think a lot of people can't imagine a public AI and don't know why we need it right off the jump, besides for just like, I don't know, like kind of simple little AI should be not just a chatbot, but like I want to give people tools and language to understand like what is it that we're actually asking for control over. And I think that information, as you described it, and attention are like kind of starts to get to that. So if you could, yeah, remind me that term.
I'm not sure what term you're referring to. I'm not sure what I said, but like what I would say, whenever we talk about AI, I would say supposedly smart technology.
Hmm.
So I would break it down. I think AI is a umbrella term that is misused and abused. It generates way too much hype. When people are talking, like at my university, on like three committees where people are talking about, well, what should we do about AI in the classroom? I'm like, what AI? And every time we have this conversation, I'm like, what AI are you talking about? Which are you talking about? Autocomplete? Are you talking about search engines? Are you talking about predictive AI? Are you talking about software my kid wrote last night in his computer science class? To do, I mean, it doesn't make any sense to talk about AI as if it's a thing, when in fact you're talking about software running on hardware that uses data in different ways to perform different functions. Like, so to me, it's always about some kind of tech, some kind of system that involves a bunch of different component pieces and parts, right? So like virtual and not, that perform different functions. And so if we're talking about, and I guess we could say generative AI is a kind of, a kind of configuration of software and tools that work in a certain way, and then that's fine. Maybe if we use AI in a very careful way and we talk about, we're sure what we're talking about. So that's the first thing. I just say like whenever like to say we have public versus private AI, I kind of don't even know what that means, to be honest. I'm like, well, there's both. I think Joanna Bryson has a book that's been supposedly coming out for the last 5 years or 10 years or whatever. But I mean, she told me about it. We were at Princeton like back in 2018 or something, but about the 10,000 year history of AI. I mean, if AI is just, a human built thing that performs functions that resemble human intelligence, we've been doing that for a pretty long time. By thermometer, right, that automates the heating and cooling in my house based on sensors that detect temperature, is an automated system that acts without human intervention. Is that AI? I guess. Is it the kind of AI we're talking about when we're talking about what should be public and private? I don't think so. I don't think it's infrastructural. Um, and I'm not being critical of you, Val, by the way. I'm just sort of saying, like, when we talk about AI, I always kind of, I go on my little rant, I guess. But I think, like, if you're thinking about what are the kinds of um, infrastructures that perform intelligence-related tasks and functions on behalf of people, and we're saying, well, shouldn't we have public versions of those? Shouldn't they be public accessible? Should we have open systems that we can all access and use? And build upon, sure, right? And I think there's sort of that I think is what Metagov is doing, and I think doing stuff like that in a way that's uh, whether the governance of those things should be pure like I think defining what the relevant community is matters, right? Is it open access? Everyone has access, and we're making it publicly available without any authentication of who you are and how you're accessing and what you're doing, or are there membership it's an open membership in the sense that anyone in the public can become a member, but they've got to actually authenticate what their uses are going to be or who they are, or that they are going to comply with certain security or their licensing provisions. And then it starts looking more like a knowledge commons or a commons governance, or in a more classic sense, kind of arrangement than a pure public open access one. So kind of like in data, we've had this conversation for a few decades now. Like open data sort of means open to the public at large without conditions, if technically. Or when you say open data, do you mean it's licensed under a Creative Commons license or something like that, which is different than unconditioned open access. So I think with AI, with artificial intelligence systems or supposedly smart tech that's software that's doing certain functions for us, we want to think about we want to ask those same sets of questions.
Yeah, I guess a quick follow-up, maybe not that quick, but I guess a follow-up is like, I think the public AI language so far has been like artificial intelligence as public infrastructure in the way that we think about like roads and stoplights and like etc. I guess I'm curious if there is like a and maybe this is more for the public AI team or people, but like is there an example of public governance of AI right now? Like, is AI being deployed in the public sector in a way that, and is it being like in a way that it isn't allowed to be governed by people? Like, what public AI systems actually exist? And like, where can we start to um, say or model like this? And your systems are more like commons governance or community governed, or that's what you've kind of presented. But even so, like what, where are the people who are making decisions together about the way that their camera, like street cameras are operating or something? Um, do you have examples like that of like systems that are governed by commons, by people that are in the public domain that are like evidence to point to, like this is the way it could work?
For AI systems, that's a good question. I don't. This is the book. It's interesting. The Governing Knowledge Commons book that Zargum's writing a chapter for, and some other. They're doing a book that the conference meeting I think is later this summer. That's on sort of AI common knowledge commons and AI, and so there may be some good examples that will come out of that. Um, I mean, I do think like actually the funny thing is I'm like brainstorming by thinking about like my son who's a freshman at Maryland and does computer science and physics and stuff like, and he codes all the time and does stuff all the time. And he's like, there's tons of tools that are available. There's lots of things on GitHub and available for people to build and use that are freely and publicly available. He's like, he just coded, built some, basically like a scheduler thing for students. He's like, students come in and they did like to school and they don't know how to really map out the 4 years, and the advisors tell them to look at this and people tell him like, he's like, it's just was driving me crazy, so I just built this thing. And so I started asking him, like, well, where did you get the code to build it and where are you storing? He's like, oh, all the stuff is stored on this. I don't remember the name of the thing that he mentioned. It's all stored on here. And I'm like, oh, what are you paying? He's like, oh, no, it's free up to a certain point, but it's much larger than I need, so I'm fine. And then he's like, doing all this stuff on GitHub, and there's a lot that's available for sort of public use as long as you're below certain size thresholds, and you're kind of, so I think there's some of that. I don't know if that's what you're getting at, or if you're getting at like GPTs, or I want to run my own LLM. Like what can I do? Are there publicly available systems that are governed in a way? And I think people are working on that, but that's not something that I have good examples to sort of throw out there. I mean, there's plenty of examples of, I mean, you could take a Wikipedia or something. There's plenty of examples of community governed knowledge commons at scale that both have software and knowledge and information, all the kinds of things that are relevant for an AI knowledge commons as well. Um,
Yep. The only thing I'd add is that there is a cost to those free systems like GitHub, and that they are harvesting your data.
yep.
I mean, you're the product. You know?
No, I'm 100. I get you. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. So yes, you're
Yeah.
you're you're totally. There's always a cost. There's always a
Yep.
business model behind those systems, and that's I mean, if I'm being 100% fair and honest about the what's missing from the infrastructure book way back when, but deliberately so, was the supply side. Like my
Mhm.
focus has always been trying to explain the demand side and where value comes from and how it is that
Mhm.
managing something as a commons enables you to create value that's not easily captured. Um, but I took it as a given that there exists supplies. There's tons of That's because pretty much most of the literature in economics and engineering and other fields focuses on the supply side. Like it's mostly about how do we get investment? How do we make sure that when I invest in something, I can recover my fixed costs and da 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 da. Like that's where most of the effort has always gone. And so I did not spend a whole lot of time in the infrastructure book sort of building out that case. But it is absolutely important. And so, you're paying with your data, you're paying with your time and attention, you're paying sometimes with being required to make your code available for others to use, like like having less ability to, depending on the system, like you've got to agree to the licensing terms, for example.
I mean, I've always loved the idea of a public option being funded by the big companies, essentially as a form of uh, antitrust. Like, listen, you could get broken up, or you can fund your own competitor, a public competitor who is not about, maximizing profit, but maximizing value, and then let the customer decide which product they want to use. So,
Yeah, I mean an argument not on AI in particular, but at the end of the infrastructure book for solution, the last chapter, we talked about a variety of different things, and I emphasized earlier slow governance and friction in design. But another thing in neutrality rules and blah blah blah. But one of the other things we did mention and talk a bit about was for dealing with social media. And it was basically like I had long ago done a project for the BBC and explained how the BBC was a kind of public infrastructure. So I used the infrastructure theory, applied to the BBC. There's a paper on SSRN or something about this, and did a separate private report for them. But it inspired this idea like, what if the BBC created a social network for everyone in the UK? I mean, every like 90+% of the people in the UK sort of listen and trust at the time to things have changed in the last 10 years, but like trust the BBC. It's a trusted source. It has access, it's immediate, it has editorial expertise. There's like a bunch of things about the BBC as an institution that at least back in the mid 2010s made it something that said, well, what about and there's two features of a BBC style social network, and there's other extrapolations of this that are worth noting. One is they have a license fee model, so they're funded by everyone, but they didn't rely on markets. They don't charge you for anything, so they could realistically say we won't surveil you and sell your you to advertisers. And they also didn't rely on the government, doesn't rely on the UK government to sort of pay them, and they don't have to go beg the government for money every year because of the way that the license fee was set up with the charter and the BBC. So on the supply side funding, they have a funding kind of model that insulated them both from political and market pressures. And then on the other side, what most social media companies will never do is they had editorial expertise. They had expertise about evaluating the quality of content. And so they could develop algorithms for their feeds because they wouldn't be prioritizing to sell you stuff in advertising and keep you clicking, right? They had like two things about BBC that were potentially attractive features of a public-minded social media system. Now, put aside what you think of the BBC today and put aside whether it didn't work. I proposed at the BBC and they said no. Rupert Murdoch will attack us if we try to do it or something. I can't remember, but it didn't work. But the features matter. So if we're thinking about like what would we want to build for AI or for something else as public alternatives, you do want to think about where can you have some kind of uh, funding model that insulates you from the standard market pressures, and then at the same time can insulate you from having to go to the government every year to ask for more money. And if you can figure out that, there's different people smarter than me working on like how to do those things, but there's different ways to do that. And then the other is whether you think what the role of knowledge or expertise should be in governing the quality of the product or the service that you're doing.
Well, thank you so much, Brett, for all of this. Please send us in chat or later in the Slack the link to your presentation. I would love again to dive in. But yeah,
Sure.
thank you everyone for joining today and Brett for your presentation. And let's continue these discussions in the Slack. Thank you so much.
Sounds good. By the way, are you gonna I didn't look at
you're
any of the
welcome.
chat because I just didn't have a chance. Are they gonna be somewhere? Does that
It,
end up
I
on?
can.
it's just
I
me
can.
yammering, basically. I mean, I wouldn't worry about it too much. I just have to get stuff out, so I stopped thinking about it.
I can
I
bring
do
the
the
chat
same thing.
over, and if there are any questions we missed, I also was just like too embedded in the presentation to see the chat. So I'll bring it into the Slack as well, and we can like start from there with the discussion.
Okay. Awesome.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks.